My name is Margaret Ellery. I am 67 years old, a white American woman who spent most of her life as a marine biologist studying the fragile heartbeat of the ocean. I have walked windswept shores in Alaska, counting sea otters, drifted over coral gardens in Fiji, and documented the migration patterns of grey whales that pass right by this very stretch of Monterey coast. When my husband Daniel, a wildlife photographer with a gift for capturing the soul of the sea in a single frame, passed away 10 years ago, he left me more than memories. He left me this house, a cedar-trimmed sanctuary with salt-worn railings and a wraparound deck that gives you the illusion of floating above the waves. Every morning I take my coffee out there and listen to the sea breathe, the low roar of the surf mingling with the cry of gulls overhead. On this particular morning, the horizon was painted in muted pink and gold, the kind of soft light that makes the water look like molten glass, when I saw her coming up the steps. Vanessa Price, 44, all polished hair and sharp angles, holding a bottle of champagne as if it were a peace offering. I had met her twice before, both times in passing, but she carried the air of someone who thought every conversation was an audition for her next big move. She did not ask if she could sit. She simply claimed a chair, crossing one leg over the other in a way that suggested she was about to negotiate the terms of my own life. She began with small talk, complimenting the view, the deck, even the sound of the waves, though her eyes roamed the property like a hawk surveying a field. Then she set the champagne on the table between us, the glass catching the morning light, and announced she had a once-in-a-lifetime offer for me. She told me she could have a buyer lined up by next week. Cash, no contingencies, top market value. All I had to do was say yes. I smiled, sipped my coffee, and told her the truth. This house is not for sale at any price. Not now. Not ever. It holds too much history, too much of who I am, and no amount of money can replace that. Her smile froze, the kind of polite mask people wear when they are already rearranging their strategy. She took the bottle back in her hands, turning it slowly as if reading a label that was not there, and told me she hoped I would think about it. I said I would not. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and gave me a look that was almost sweet, except for the steel behind it. Then she walked down the steps, the click of her heels swallowed by the crash of the tide, leaving me with the uneasy sense that I had just refused more than an offer. I had refused an opening move. Over the next week, I began to feel the shoreline of my life shifting, not with the sudden violence of a storm, but with the slow and deliberate pull of a changing tide. My name is Margaret Ellery, 67 years old, white American, retired marine biologist, and I have lived in this Monterey beach house for over a decade, without once doubting that my neighbors were part of the steady rhythm of my days. We waved from across the road, exchanged gossip about weather and fishing conditions, shared extra loaves of sourdough or buckets of freshly caught crab. That easy current of familiarity seemed to falter after my encounter with Vanessa Price. I would pass by Mary Lou from 2 doors down, and instead of her usual smile, she would busy herself adjusting the straps on her tote bag, pretending not to see me. Carl, who once dropped in unannounced for coffee, now gave a curt nod before retreating indoors. Even the young couple who rented the bungalow near the pier seemed to hesitate before returning my wave, as if caught between habit and hesitation. The air itself seemed to carry a different texture, thicker somehow, with conversations that stopped when I entered a room. One morning, I went into the cafe for my usual cinnamon roll and black coffee, and the owner, Tom, glanced around before leaning in and lowering his voice. He said he had overheard something I should know. Vanessa had been in earlier in the week, sipping a latte and telling anyone who would listen that she was concerned about me, that she had noticed I seemed forgetful lately, that living alone by the ocean might not be safe for a woman my age. She had said it in that sugar-coated tone people use when they are sharpening a knife behind their back. The words hit me harder than the salt air on a winter morning. It was not enough that she wanted my house. She was laying the foundation to make me look incapable of living in it. In the world of property and perception, it is not the deed that wins the battle. It is the story people believe. I thanked Tom, left a generous tip, and walked home with the wind whipping my hair into my face, my mind racing. I thought of the kelp forests I once studied, how an invasive species could slip in quietly, unnoticed at first, until one day the entire ecosystem was altered beyond recognition. Vanessa was doing the same thing here, weaving herself into the narrative of my life in a way that made her seem concerned, even benevolent, while slowly eroding the trust others had in me. Standing on my deck with the Pacific stretching endlessly before me, I understood that this was no casual interest on her part. This was strategy. And I, who had spent my life tracking the hidden movements of the sea, would now have to turn that skill toward tracking the hidden movements of my new adversary. It started with a letter slipped into my mailbox, the kind printed on official-looking stationery that makes your stomach tighten before you even open it. The Monterey County Zoning Board was requesting an inspection of my deck due to an anonymous complaint claiming it was unsafe and a hazard to the public. I stood on that deck, running my hand along the smooth cedar railing Daniel had built with care, and felt the accusation like a splinter under my skin. The next day, a second letter arrived, this one alleging that my property line extended illegally into public land, as though I had been creeping forward over the years like a tide that refused to retreat. I knew immediately this was not coincidence. Vanessa Price had the kind of social reach that could pull strings in places most people never thought to look, the kind that could turn a whisper into an official record. I remembered her tight smile as she walked away from my deck that morning, and I understood this was not about persuasion anymore. It was about pressure. I kept my voice steady when the inspectors arrived, two men in county windbreakers who seemed almost apologetic as they measured and photographed, their eyes darting toward the ocean as if wishing they were anywhere else. I offered them coffee. They declined. And I watched from the kitchen window as they packed their equipment and left, the gravel crunching under their boots. That night, I began a new ritual. I kept a notebook on the dining table, its cover plain and unremarkable, and each time something happened, I wrote down the date, time, and details. The habit felt familiar, like my field journals from my years studying marine life, except now the subject under observation was human behavior, or perhaps human intrusion. Anonymous notes under my door warning that my property was being watched. A car idling too long near my driveway before pulling away. A sudden visit from the homeowners association asking about the condition of my retaining wall. Outwardly, I remained cordial, answering questions, signing forms, nodding as if I accepted the process without suspicion. Inwardly, I was building a map, a record of each ripple Vanessa sent into my waters. I knew that to confront her now would be like shouting at a rip current. It would only drag me out farther and faster. Instead, I kept my breathing slow, my tone even, the way I had learned to approach a skittish sea turtle, knowing the key was to get close without alarming it. The difference here was that Vanessa was no gentle creature. She was a predator circling the edges, and I would need to watch every move she made before I decided when and where to strike. Standing on my deck after the inspectors left, the Pacific rolled in dark and relentless beneath the fading light, and I thought how the ocean never rushes its revenge. It waits, patient and certain, wearing down even the strongest stone. I have always believed that the ocean hides as much as it reveals, that its calm surface can conceal entire worlds of turbulence and danger, and it occurred to me that people are no different. If Vanessa Price was determined to dredge up lies about me, then it was time I began dredging for the truth about her. I thought immediately of Jack Monroe, an old friend from my years working with a coastal conservation group in Los Angeles. Back then, he was the only reporter who ever cared enough to write about pollution violations by powerful companies, and he had the stubbornness to keep asking questions even when doors slammed in his face. We had not spoken in years, but when I called and told him I needed information on a woman named Vanessa Price, his tone sharpened the way it used to before he caught a scent worth chasing. 3 days later, my phone rang, and Jack's voice carried the satisfaction of a fisherman who had just hauled in a net heavy with catch. He told me Vanessa's trail was a tangle of lawsuits, failed partnerships, and deals that collapsed in a cloud of accusations. There was a condo development in Malibu where she left contractors unpaid, a Beverly Hills renovation that ended in a bitter court battle with the previous owner, and an entire circle of wealthy acquaintances who had once sung her praises but now would not speak her name without a trace of venom. Jack even found whispers of a real estate license suspension that she had managed to bury under layers of legal maneuvering. As he spoke, I wrote everything down, my hand moving steadily across the page, the way I once recorded field data about tides and water temperatures, knowing that accuracy was its own quiet weapon. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and opened a new file folder, labeling it simply Vanessa Price. Into it, I placed every note, every document Jack had sent, along with printed screenshots of news clippings and public records. I began thinking of it as my specimen jar, each piece of her history preserved in the clear fluid of fact. I read through it slowly, feeling a cold steadiness settle in my chest. This was no misunderstanding, no neighborly disagreement. Vanessa was a practiced operator, someone who moved from place to place, leaving fractures in her wake. And now she had chosen my shore as her next hunting ground. I realized that to face her, I would need more than indignation. I would need evidence, patterns, and a story that could stand in the harsh light of scrutiny. As the sun dipped low, I slid the folder into the bottom drawer of my desk, the same drawer where I once kept Daniel's film rolls before they were developed. Back then, the images were hidden but inevitable, waiting for the right moment to be brought into the light. That was exactly how I intended to treat what I now held in my hands. The envelope arrived by courier just after breakfast, thick and cream-coloured, with the kind of embossed lettering that tries to make paper feel like a weapon. Inside was an official offer to purchase my home, drafted by a Los Angeles real estate attorney on behalf of Vanessa Price. The language was polished and deliberate, offering a sum that might have dazzled someone else, followed by a paragraph that dripped with false civility, warning that refusal could lead to unpleasant legal consequences regarding zoning compliance and property rights. I read it twice, my pulse steady, then set it aside as I rinsed my coffee cup. I had no intention of letting her think she had frightened me. Instead, I picked up the phone and called someone who had stood in my corner long before I ever heard Vanessa's name. Thomas Adler had been my lawyer since Daniel and I first bought the house. A man with silver hair and a calm voice who treated every legal document like a puzzle waiting to be solved. I told him everything, from the champagne morning on my deck to the anonymous complaints and the growing file in my desk drawer. When he read the letter, his lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, the kind that meant he had already spotted something worth exploring. We shifted the conversation to Vanessa's property, a sleek beach-adjacent home she had purchased less than 2 years ago. Thomas pulled up public records while I listened to the rhythmic click of his keyboard, the the same way I once listened for the steady ping of sonar equipment during whale tracking. What he found was more than I had dared hope for. Vanessa's mortgage had been structured with an unusual short-term clause that required a balloon payment within 18 months, and that date was fast approaching. More importantly, there was a lien on the property for unpaid contractor fees, which meant that if she failed to meet her obligations, her home could be forced into auction. Thomas leaned back in his chair and looked at me as though we had both just glimpsed the same rare creature surfacing from deep water. This, he said, could be used as leverage, or perhaps something more. I felt the shift inside me, the slow turning of the tide. All this time she had been trying to make me look unstable, incapable, vulnerable, while her own foundation was already cracked. It reminded me of the rock formations I had studied along eroding coastlines, grand and imposing to the eye, yet hollowed out beneath the surface until one day they collapsed into the sea. I told Thomas to proceed quietly, to watch the timelines and keep our findings between us. If Vanessa wanted a legal battle, she would have one, but not the kind she was expecting. As I left his office, the ocean smell wrapped around me, and I thought how satisfying it would be to let her dig her own pit, only to find I had been the one holding the shovel all along. Some victories announce themselves with trumpets. Others slip quietly into your hands like a shell the tide leaves behind. And when I learned about the state of Vanessa Price's property, I knew I was holding the beginning of something that could change everything. Thomas had been monitoring her mortgage situation as we discussed, keeping an eye on the balloon payment deadline. But what surfaced was even better than we imagined. Over a cup of strong coffee in his office, he slid a document across the desk toward me, his expression calm, but edged with the satisfaction of a man who enjoys the quiet elegance of strategy. Vanessa's sleek beach-adjacent home was in default on its property taxes, not by accident, but by neglect. The county records showed months of non-payment, the kind that triggers a lien and, if left unresolved, results in a public auction. I traced my finger over the figures, feeling the weight of the opportunity settle in my chest. If I could quietly buy that lien before she noticed, I could stand at that auction and take the keys to her house without ever raising my voice. The irony of it was almost too perfect, like watching a predator trip over its own trap. I thought of all the mornings she must have walked through those rooms, confident she was tightening a noose around my life, never realizing her own foundation was crumbling beneath her. The scientist in me recognized the moment for what it was, a turning of the current, the instant when the prey pivots and the hunter becomes the hunted. Still, I knew better than to rush. The ocean has taught me that timing is as important as force, that a wave breaking too early loses its strength, but one that builds quietly can knock down even the tallest cliff. I told Thomas to make the necessary inquiries under a name unconnected to mine, to ensure the purchase of the lien happened so far beneath Vanessa's radar that she would never sense the change until it was far too late. I left his office and walked along the shoreline until the sand cooled beneath my bare feet, the surf folding over itself in a rhythm older than memory. In the distance, I could see my own house standing steady against the horizon, its weathered cedar a reminder of what endures when it is built on care rather than vanity. I imagined Vanessa's property stripped of its curated perfection, her curated life boxed up and carted away, and I felt no guilt, only a sense of balance restoring itself. She had chosen this contest, not me, and now I would simply finish it. For now, I would keep my smile in place and my words measured when I saw her in town, letting her believe she still held the upper hand. The truth could wait. The tide was coming in, and when it reached her door, it would not be me she heard knocking. There is a certain art to letting someone think they are winning, to leaning back just enough for them to mistake your patience for surrender. And in the days that followed, I became a student of that art. I knew Vanessa Price prided herself on reading people, on spotting hesitation and using it as leverage, so I gave her exactly what she wanted to see. When we crossed paths at the market, I let my smile falter just enough to suggest weariness. When she mentioned her generous offer in front of others, I let my gaze drift as if the subject were difficult for me. It was a performance. And like any good performance, it required timing and detail. After 2 weeks of this calculated meekness, I invited her over for tea, telling her we should discuss the details of her proposal before I made my decision. Her eyes lit with the satisfaction of a fisherman who believes the line is pulling exactly as planned. On the morning she arrived, I set out my best china, the delicate blue and white cups Daniel and I had found in a small shop on the Oregon coast, their edges thin as seashells. I brewed the tea with a sprig of fresh mint from my garden, letting the steam curl between us as she settled into a chair on the deck. She talked easily, her voice smooth and confident, sketching out plans for how she would improve the property, replace the weathered cedar railings with sleek glass, install a modern kitchen in place of my warm wooden cabinets, and transform my sanctuary into something fit for the glossy pages of a real estate magazine. I nodded in the right places, asked small questions, even feigned concern about whether the process would be complicated for me. All the while, my mind was elsewhere, ticking off the steps Thomas and I had set in motion. The lien purchase had gone through quietly, our names absent from any document that might tie it to me, and the auction date was now fixed. The current had shifted, and all I needed to do was keep Vanessa from sensing the undertow until it was too late. When she left that afternoon, she patted my hand like a patient aunt comforting a nervous child, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The Pacific stretched beyond her shoulder, deep and endless, and I thought of how it wears away stone without noise or drama, working in silence until one day the cliff gives way. I would be that tide, steady and sure, letting her think she was steering the course while I charted a destination she could not see. In town that evening, I heard her telling someone at the cafe that she thought I would come around soon, that I had finally seen reason. I smiled to myself as I walked past, the weight of the truth tucked away like a secret compass. Only I knew how to read. The morning of the auction broke clear and bright, the kind of California day that fools you into thinking nothing in the world could possibly shift beneath your feet. And I sat at my kitchen table sipping coffee while the real work happened miles away. Thomas had arranged for a proxy to attend the county property lien auction, a man whose name would mean nothing to Vanessa Price or anyone in her orbit. And together, we had laid out the exact figure to bid, high enough to secure the house without sparking suspicion. Vanessa, I knew, was spending this same morning in a different kind of meeting, one she believed would seal the fate of my home. She was likely sitting in her lawyer's office, all glossy hair and designer perfume, signing preliminary documents for what she imagined was her imminent purchase of my beach house. I pictured her reviewing her plans, perhaps even gloating to a friend about how close she was to prying me out of my own sanctuary, never realizing that the ground beneath her was already slipping away. The county auction was an unremarkable affair, held in a bland meeting room with folding chairs and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingering from earlier in the day. My proxy sat quietly, raising his numbered card only when the auctioneer's voice called out the lot that represented Vanessa's property. A few half-hearted bids trickled in from other attendees, but no one there had the motivation or the resources to match the ceiling we had set. In less than 5 minutes, the gavel fell, and the house that Vanessa had treated like a stage for her curated life was no longer hers in the eyes of the law. Thomas sent me a short text, nothing more than "done," and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. It reminded me of the moment after surfacing from a deep dive, when your lungs finally fill and the world sharpens back into focus. I looked out toward the Pacific, its waves calm and glinting in the morning sun, and thought of how victory often arrives, not with fireworks, but with the simple turning of a key in a lock. Vanessa would not know today, or even tomorrow. For now, she would still believe she was winning, that I was the one being moved off the board. I would let her have that illusion a little longer, because illusions are the most effective when they are allowed to ripen just before they shatter. The satisfaction was not in the acquisition itself, but in knowing that every step she had taken to push me from my home had led her directly into the place where I could close the door behind her. I set my empty coffee cup in the sink and felt the steadiness of the tide within me, patient and inevitable, waiting for the exact moment to let her see what the ocean had carried away. The next morning, the air was cool and sharp, the kind that makes the ocean look like hammered silver, and I walked the short stretch to Vanessa Price's house with a thick manila envelope tucked under my arm. I had considered sending the documents through her lawyer, but there was a satisfaction in delivering them myself, in watching the moment her carefully constructed world shifted. When she opened the door, she was dressed in a silk robe the color of champagne, her hair perfectly arranged, her expression poised in that studied way of hers that always suggested she was 2 steps ahead of everyone else. I greeted her with a polite good morning, keeping my voice even, and asked if she had a moment. She glanced at the envelope, curiosity flickering in her eyes, and stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled faintly of expensive candles and fresh coffee, the kind of curated atmosphere that seemed designed to convince the world she had everything under control. I placed the envelope on the marble kitchen island and slid it toward her without a word. She arched an eyebrow, drawing out the moment before finally pulling the flap open. The first page was the official record from the county, listing me as the legal owner of the property. Behind it was the proof of the lien purchase, the auction receipt, and the signed transfer of ownership. She stared at the papers as though they were written in a language she could not understand, the silence between us stretching thin. I watched the small signs first, the slight tightening around her mouth, the faint tremor in the hand that held the page, the way her shoulders stiffened as the reality settled in. Her voice, when it finally came, was not the smooth and measured tone I was used to, but something sharper and thinner, asking what kind of trick this was. I told her there was no trick, only the law, and that as of yesterday the house she was standing in belonged to me outright. For the first time since I had met her, the veneer of control cracked, and I saw the raw disbelief in her eyes. She looked down at the papers again, as if repetition might change their meaning, but the black ink remained the same. I said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say, and I turned to leave, pausing only to thank her for her time. Outside, the salt air filled my lungs, and I felt the same quiet exhilaration I used to feel after surfacing from a long dive, the world sharper and lighter. Behind me, I imagined her standing in that pristine kitchen, surrounded by the life she thought was untouchable, now holding proof that the tide had come in and carried it away while she was too busy watching someone else's shore. 2 days after delivering the proof of ownership, I returned to Vanessa Price's front door with a different kind of envelope. This one slimmer, but carrying far greater weight. The morning was bright, the kind where the Pacific seemed to glow from within. But the warmth in the air had nothing to do with the mood I carried. When she opened the door, she was dressed for battle, though her armor was silk and diamonds, and her eyes were already sharp with suspicion. I greeted her politely, handed over the envelope, and waited. She tore it open quickly, scanning the first lines before looking up at me with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. It was a formal eviction notice, granting her 30 days to vacate the premises in accordance with the law. I could almost hear the waves breaking on the shore behind me as she began to speak, her words spilling out in a rapid tide of threats. She said she would have me in court within the week, that she would call the police, that I would regret ever crossing her. Each accusation and promise of retaliation was delivered with the force of someone who had spent her entire life winning by intimidation, but I had weathered storms far greater than this. I told her calmly that she was welcome to pursue any legal avenue she wished, though she might want to review the property records first, as they would confirm that every step had been taken in full compliance with the law. Her voice rose, but I let it pass over me, her anger breaking against the rock of the ironclad foundation Thomas and I had built. I thought of the kelp forests I once studied, how they could sway violently in the current, yet remain rooted deep into the ocean floor, unshaken no matter how strong the surge. That was how I felt standing there, letting her fury wash over me without moving me an inch. When she saw that her words were not piercing my composure, she shifted tactics, accusing me of cruelty, of plotting against her, of destroying her life. I reminded her, gently but firmly, that this was the consequence of her own neglect, that the law does not care for curated images or polished charm. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat she could have made. I turned to leave, the sound of the surf carrying in from the beach, a reminder that tides turn whether we wish them to or not. Behind me, I could hear her pacing, her footsteps quick and uneven, the sound of someone realizing the horizon she had been sailing toward no longer existed. As I walked back to my own house, the gulls wheeled overhead, their calls sharp and bright. And I thought about how justice, like the sea, often moves in its own time, but always arrives with certainty. I had always known that truth, once set free, has a way of traveling faster than any lie. And when the time felt right, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the thick file I had been building for weeks. Inside were the notes from my calls with Jack, the printed court records, the articles that hinted at her failed ventures, and the testimonies from people who had once considered themselves her friends before learning what friendship with Vanessa Price truly cost. I chose my audience carefully, starting with those in town whose voices carried in the quiet way that mattered most, the ones who could speak a fact over coffee and have it ripple across the community by afternoon. I did not frame it as gossip, but as concern, showing them the documents and letting the weight of the evidence speak for itself. Their expressions shifted as they turned each page, from polite interest to quiet astonishment, and finally to something sharper, the look of people realizing they had been played. Within days, the transformation was visible. The same neighbors who had once turned their eyes away when I passed now stopped to greet me, their warmth returning like the tide after a storm. Conversations at the market took on a new tone, and I noticed Vanessa's name spoken less as admiration and more as caution. At the cafe, where I had once overheard her planting seeds about my supposed decline, she now sat alone, nursing a coffee, her phone in hand, scrolling with the tight posture of someone aware that eyes were on her for all the wrong reasons. I did not linger when I saw her there, but I caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders when she realized that the subtle barrier she had once built around me now surrounded her instead. It reminded me of the tide pools I used to study, small and self-contained worlds that could seem perfect until a shift in the water exposed everything hiding beneath. By the end of the week, the shift was complete. People who had once courted her favor now kept their distance, not with confrontation, but with absence, and absence can be more cutting than anger. Even the real estate agents who had eagerly attended her gatherings no longer appeared at her door, as if her name itself carried the risk of association. I did not need to say a word to her about it. The work was already done, carried by the current of a community that values its own over the designs of an outsider. Standing on my deck one evening, the air salted and cool. I could hear the faint sound of music drifting from her house, though it was punctuated by long pauses, as if she were replaying the same track out of habit rather than joy. The Pacific stretched dark and endless before me, steady and certain, and I knew that the truth, once loosed into the water, could never be caught again. The day the movers came was bright and windless, the kind of morning when the ocean looks like it is holding its breath, and I walked up the path to Vanessa Price's house with a calm that felt almost ceremonial. The eviction clock had run its course, and the front door was propped open as men in worn t-shirts and work gloves carried box after box down the steps to the waiting truck. Each time they passed me, I caught glimpses of her life reduced to cardboard and packing tape, the curated perfection of her rooms dismantled piece by piece. I stepped inside and found the space already stripped of its personality, the sleek furniture gone, the expensive art taken down, the air carrying that faint, hollow echo that only empty houses have. I wandered slowly from room to room, my footsteps soft against the bare floors, imagining how I would change them. The living room with its wide windows would be opened even more, framing the Pacific like a moving painting. The guest bedrooms would be light and airy, ready to welcome visiting scientists and conservationists for the projects I had long dreamed of hosting. The kitchen, now cold and metallic, would be warm wood and stone, a place for conversation as much as cooking. Each vision came to me easily, as natural as the tide reshaping the shore after a storm. When I reached the deck, I paused to take in the view that had once been hers, the ocean stretching out in an unbroken sweep of blue and silver, the horizon steady as a promise. Down on the curb, Vanessa stood beside the truck, her phone in hand, scrolling and tapping with the tight focus of someone searching for a solution that no longer existed. Her hair was pulled back, her expression set in a mask that was starting to crack around the edges. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, in the restless movement of her free hand as she adjusted the strap of her bag over and over. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence, as if the scaffolding she had built her life upon had been quietly dismantled without her noticing. I did not wave or speak, and she did not look up. The movers closed the truck doors with a dull clang, the sound carrying down the quiet street like the final note of a song. As I walked back toward my own home, the scent of salt water and cedar wrapped around me, and I thought about how endings often come without grand declarations. Just a door left open to an empty room and the sound of footsteps fading away. The ocean rolled on, steady and indifferent, and I knew this house would soon be filled again, not with the hollow performance of ownership, but with work and purpose, the kind that endures long after names are forgotten. The first time I stepped back into the house, after the keys were officially mine, the rooms still held the faint echo of emptiness, that hollow sound you get when a space is waiting to be claimed, and I knew exactly what I wanted it to become. For years, I had imagined a place where scientists, artists, and volunteers could stay while working on coastal preservation projects. A living space that would hum with the exchange of ideas and the quiet rhythm of purposeful work. Vanessa's former home, with its sweeping ocean views and wide, light-filled rooms, was the perfect canvas. I began by stripping away the sterile elegance she had curated, replacing the cold glass and chrome with warm wood, soft fabrics, and colours drawn from the shoreline at dusk. The living room became a communal gathering space, with shelves filled with books on marine biology, photography, and environmental policy, and large tables where maps and research could be spread out alongside mugs of strong coffee. The guest rooms were painted in calm shades of seafoam and sand, each one furnished simply but with care, ready to welcome the people who would carry this mission forward. In the backyard, I built a long, weathered table beneath the old cypress tree, a place for shared meals where the sound of the waves could become part of every conversation. The transformation was not just physical, but alive with intention, and word spread quickly through the community. Locals stopped by to see the changes, offering help with painting, lending tools, and bringing trays of food for the workers. Fishermen I had known for years came to talk about conservation efforts, and artists brought their easels to capture the changing light over the water. What had once been a house that seemed to belong to one person's ambition was becoming a home for many hands and voices. The first group of guests arrived on a clear spring afternoon: marine biologists from Oregon and a photographer from Santa Cruz, their gear piled in the hallway, their excitement visible in every movement. That night, we sat at the long table under the cypress, sharing stories as the tide whispered against the shore, and I felt the truth of what this place had become. The community, once fractured by whispers and suspicion, now saw me not only as the woman who had held onto her home, but as someone willing to open her doors to a shared future. Standing on the deck later that evening, the air cool against my face, I thought about how the ocean never truly erases what was before. It reshapes it, incorporating it into something new. This house had been a stage for vanity, but now it would be a harbour for purpose. And in that quiet transformation, the past had been not erased, but renewed. The evening light spilled across the water in bands of gold and rose, the kind of sunset that makes the Pacific look like it is holding a secret just beneath the surface. And I sat on my deck with a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. The steam curled upward, carrying the faint scent of honey, and I let the quiet settle over me like a familiar blanket. My beach house looked exactly as it had the day Daniel and I first stood here together, the cedar railings weathered by salt and time, the windows open to let the ocean breeze wander in. It had survived every storm, every high tide, and most recently, every calculated attempt to pry it from my hands. Now it was not only mine still, but its twin in view down the shoreline was mine as well, a house transformed from a monument to vanity into a living place with a purpose that reached beyond its walls. From here I could see its outline against the fading light, the cypress tree standing like a sentinel in the yard, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing it was no longer a fortress for one, but a harbour for many. I thought of the first guests who had already passed through its rooms, the scientists who left behind pages of notes, the artists whose canvases caught the shifting blues of the sea, the volunteers who rose early to walk the beach collecting the debris the tide had left behind. Their laughter and conversations still seemed to drift faintly in my mind, woven into the same rhythm as the waves. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the salt air mix with the floral warmth on my tongue, and considered how little and how much had changed. My own home remained untouched in spirit, its walls holding the same photographs, the same seashells gathered from years of travelling, the same worn rug in the living room that had felt Daniel's footsteps. Yet my world had widened in a way I had not anticipated, expanding like the horizon on a clear day when you realize it goes farther than you thought. The battle for this house had been about more than property, though it took me time to see that. It had been about keeping the heart of my life intact, and in defending it, I had created something larger than myself. The sun sank lower, the colours deepening into fire along the horizon, and I leaned back in my chair, feeling the boards of the deck firm beneath my feet. I thought about how the ocean never clings to a single wave. It releases each one to make way for the next. And I knew there would be more tides, more changes. But for now, both houses stood as they should. One a home, the other a mission, and both under my care. Months had passed since the movers carried the last of Vanessa Price's belongings away from the house that now hummed with the work of marine conservation. And life had settled into a steady rhythm again, the kind that feels earned rather than assumed. I was in the kitchen early one morning, the kettle just beginning to hiss, when a neighbour stopped by with fresh bread from her oven and the kind of news people share in hushed tones, not out of secrecy, but from the awareness that some stories carry their own weight. Vanessa, she told me, had left Monterey altogether, slipping quietly back to Los Angeles. There was no grand return to the circles she had once moved in, no new oceanfront home to display, only a small apartment in a part of the city where the sea could not be heard. I thanked my neighbour, set the bread on the counter, and poured the water over my tea leaves, feeling no rush of triumph, no sharp taste of vindication, only a quiet understanding that some victories do not need an audience. The most satisfying revenge is not a headline or a shouted declaration. It is living well while the one who tried to undo you quietly unravels in the background. I thought about her walking through those rooms now. Rooms without wide ocean views, without the performance of grandeur, and wondered if she felt the absence or if she filled it with the same curated illusions that had always shielded her from the truth. Either way, it no longer concerned me. My days were full in ways they had not been before. The guest house alive with new faces and ideas, the shoreline cleaner with every project completed, the community stronger in its connections. In defending what was mine, I had found a deeper sense of purpose, one that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what I wanted to leave behind. That is the part people rarely tell you about when they talk of revenge, how the real reward is not the fall of the other person, but the rise you make for yourself in the process. Standing on my deck later that afternoon, tea in hand, I watched the tide curl in gentle arcs along the shore, the sun glinting off the surface like scattered coins, and I felt the kind of peace that comes when you know the storm has passed. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Vanessa was beginning her life again in a place without this view, without this air, without this community. I did not wish her harm, but I did not wish her back. The ocean rolled on, indifferent to our battles, and I knew that its lesson had always been this: to endure, to shape the shore in your own time, and to let the rest be carried away with the tide.